Good morning, afternoon, and evening, and everyone, and welcome to Global Insights, a live, weekly interactive panel discussion which sheds light on big questions currently facing policymakers, planners, and scholars worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading institutes of international affairs, including the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Waterloo, Canada, the American University in Washington, D.C., the Institute for Strategic Affairs in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, Warwick University in the United Kingdom, and Konstanz University in Germany. Today's live stream production is entitled COVID-19, Surveillance, Intelligence, and Security. My name is Fitz-Gerald, and I'm the director of the Balsillie School, and I'm delighted to serve as moderator for today's session. A warm welcome to all of you in the audience, and there are many of you today. We would invite you to direct any questions that you may have for the panelists using the Q&A function on the Zoom panel, and we will do our best to channel those to the appropriate panelists, particularly towards the latter part of the session. We're privileged today to host four well-known experts on issues relating to intelligence, surveillance, and security. James Goldgeier is a Robert Bosch Senior Visiting Fellow at the Brookings Institution and a professor of international relations at the American University's School of International Service, where he served as dean from 2011 to 2017. Florian Kerschbaum is an associate professor at the Cheriton School of Computing Science at University of Waterloo. Prior to this, he worked as chief research expert at SAP in Germany. He is interested in data security and privacy in the entire data science pipeline. Tom Sorell has held previous appointments at the University of Birmingham, the University of Essex, Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Harvard University. He has published a book on ethics and politics of emergencies and is widely published on issues relating to pandemic influenza. Berhan Taye is a researcher who investigates the relationship between technology, society, and social justice. She is a senior policy analyst and global internet shutdowns lead at Access Now. A warm welcome to all the panelists today. I want to start right away on a big question about COVID-19 and war. Governments have often declared war on a range of issues such as terrorism, drugs, etc. Now many are holding up COVID-19 as a major threat to national security. Berhan, let's start with you. What do you feel about the narrative of war on COVID and the invisible enemy?
Thank you so much for hosting, and thank you for that really great, excellent way of starting this conversation. I think I definitely disagree with the narrative of using war as a pretext to what we're facing right now. Because when we're specifically, we're at a moment historically that this generation probably has not experienced anything like this. I myself haven't, my parents haven't. So we had this opportunity to frame something that we're all collectively, globally are experiencing. Maybe the other similar thing that we're experiencing right now is climate change, right? So the other collective experience from all the way from China to Ethiopia to Kenya to the US to Antarctica to New Zealand is this pandemic that we're all living in. And the framing that we have for it is war. And we couldn't come up with anything beyond war. That's really devastating for a lot of us that are in the peace building work and in the peace building space. And what's really interesting is that and a lot of authors have written about this is that if it was about war, the US should have come on top of this. If it was about war, France should have been the best at this, right? If it was about war, Germany should not have any problem. But it's not about war. It's not about going ahead and shooting people to stop the pandemic. The other really devastating here, and I'm from Ethiopia, I live in Kenya, and in my part of the world, at least a lot of people, at least when the pandemic started, a lot of people were killed in protecting them from the pandemic than the pandemic killing them, right? So, a lot of governments have invested a lot in security. If they had invested in health, maybe we would not have been in this position. Some countries in my part of the world only have 5, 6, 10, 15 ventilators. How is that possible? But if you look at how they've invested in security, how they've invested in their military, they should have been the first ones to come on top of this. So even this narrative that, it's about war is about sacrifice, right? Like, so you give up the weak ones and you protect the strong ones. That's what we've done in Sweden, where 11,000, like significant majority of the people that died were older citizens. It's about that bargaining. While it should have been about our collective effort, our collective, our collective strength. And what we've seen now here, I can tell you, the way that, people are funded, like crowdsource funding, the way that people are organizing, the way people are, protesting out on the streets, online and offline, is what we're seeing. So this is not about war. But the reason why governments want us to think about this as war is precisely so that they can, invest in war machines, invest in all of those things that we won't benefit from. So the war narrative is extremely flawed.
Thank you very much. James Goldgeier, what does this tell us about our possibly narrow conceptions of national security to date?
Yeah, well, I agree with what's just been said, because this really isn't about declaring war, it's about building resilience. And, it's interesting when you think back 30 years, the end of the Cold War, there were a lot of academics who wanted to, especially outside the United States, who wanted to broaden the definition of security within the academic field. And there were a lot of traditional academics who pushed back, saying, no, that's going to dilute the field. And you've had in recent years new journals that have arisen because of that. And we're going to have citizens who demand that their governments keep them safe from non-military threats like pandemics. I hope that will finally broaden the way we think about these issues. And when we look specifically at the United States, both COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter show that when citizens think about security, it's not just about whether the state is protecting them against external threats, but whether the state itself becomes a threat. In the case of COVID, the federal government's failure to respond effectively to the pandemic has led to tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths in the United States. I mean, this is just appalling. And Black Lives Matter is first and foremost about the threat of state-sanctioned violence against African Americans in the form of police brutality against citizens who are doing nothing other than jogging, walking, sleeping, or living while Black. And that's a security issue.
Thanks very much. Tom Sorell, can I ask you about data collection? Is it a mistake to regard data collection for COVID-19 purposes as a continuation of the misguided policy of data collection which started during the War on Terror?
Yes, I think that is a mistake. I have in mind particularly an interview that was done by Edward Snowden with the magazine called Vice in April. He talked about COVID surveillance as being part of a long-standing system, an architecture of oppression, he called it. And I think he meant by that there was a certain kind of continuity between what had been done with bulk collection by the NSA, the sort of thing that first brought Snowden into prominence, and what's being done under COVID surveillance. I think that's very misleading, at the very least, that there's a very great difference between bulk collection for counterterrorism and COVID surveillance. One of the most important differences is the scientific basis for the COVID surveillance. That's to say, the basis in virology and epidemiology, which has no counterpart in the war against terrorism, such as it is. So I think that's one of the important issues here. But there's another, which is to misdescribe the kind of centralization that takes place. It's one thing to talk about centralization when one has the NSA and the American government, looking at communications data of its own citizens and people abroad. But when we're talking about COVID surveillance, that isn't always the case. It's a public health authority or a national health service that's collecting the data, not the government. And the usual sinister associations of government collection of data that have been made possible by Snowden's exaggerations, it seems to me, don't apply and shouldn't be thought to apply.
Thanks very much. Let's continue on that theme of data. Florian Kerschbaum, your research, for the most part, concerns a lot about contact tracing apps. What should concern a security researcher besides privacy about these apps?
So I would like to thank you and my previous panelists for making excellent points. And as a technologist, I want to take a little bit of a look ahead of what could happen if we employ these kind of tracing apps. And we definitely have currently ongoing the privacy debate, which is a very, very important debate. And thanks for Tom for making those excellent comments. However, what I, as a security researcher, now get more and more concerned about is that this app actually is becoming part of the critical infrastructure. So we want such an app to be able to change people's behaviors. If you get a notification, we want you to stay at home, right? And this is a quite significant impact that such an app can have on people. Now think about a malicious actor, whoever that may be, using such an app to send all of Toronto, all of Waterloo into isolation for half a day until the mess is being cleaned up. Now, first of all, we would lose a lot of trust into those apps, and we would have quite a significant impact on public life. So these things seem to me to be quite concerning, and quite frankly, I don't even think that's hard to do. I have currently the hypothesis that a very small group of people might even be able to come up with such an attack. And fortunately, however, on the other side, we have not seen too many attacks on critical infrastructure, despite their significant vulnerabilities.
So, Florian, let's just continue there for a minute. Are these apps even necessary?
Now, that's another excellent question. Thank you for that question. And the question is, we have to see that such an app, what does such an app do? On the one hand, we have location data. Where has everyone been? And on the other hand, we have health data, like who is infected, who has been a part of a tracing situation. And both of those pieces of information, both of those databases, I want to say as technologists, they do exist, right? You just have to go to Google or Apple, and they can tell you where you have been every minute of the past whatever kind of period of time. And we have health authorities which can definitely tell you these people have been tested positively, right? So all I have to do is I have to take these two pieces of information and I have to combine them. And I have pretty good tracing information. I mean, the Canadian government could go ahead, or any government could go ahead that doesn't think they could get enough force on Apple or Google and could tell to their mobile phone providers, crank up your antennas and you know where everyone is at every point of time, and tell the public health authorities, collect the mobile phone number of everyone who gets infected. And we would have that information. So an app in that sense is the more privacy preserving solution. Somebody has put it like that. The app is the social contract that we have in order to collect and combine these sources of information. And therefore, the public debate about these apps is very interesting, very important to have. And I'm actually happy to see it going on.
Great, thank you very much. James Goldgeier, let's go to you. Now, these contact tracing apps and surveillance technology have often in the past been associated with authoritarian regimes. How do you feel democratic governments can convince their populations that they can use this technology responsibly?
Well, I think especially in the United States, it's going to be difficult. And it is an interesting feature of this. You know, when we used to talk about Big Brother and thinking about the essence of an authoritarian state, it was always that it keeps track of individuals, it keeps track of what they're saying, it keeps track of who they're meeting with, and so on. And our notion of a liberal democracy has always been that individuals have a private sphere that's off limits to government. And so this is a challenging situation because I think you have to give up some privacy to combat the pandemic. It's something that certainly in the United States we've gotten somewhat used to since September 11th, 2001. But it's tough in a country like the United States where trust in government is so low. That's partly what makes it difficult here. I mean, look at the situation in the United States. We can't even get people to wear masks. Because they're like, I'm not having the government tell me what to do. So we face a real challenge because it just goes against sort of this notion that governments stay out of my business.
Yeah, thanks so much. Berhan, come in and tell us your views about privacy and the extent to which we can have a little bit of privacy encroached upon.
Yeah, so I think the previous speaker alluded to this fact that you can merge all of this information, and the extent of the way that you can use this information could be quite deadly. So, when we talk about privacy, I always want to contextualize it. For me, as a woman that potentially might get abortion one day, will probably get abortion. Like, you have to think about it in terms of where things are a taboo. For instance, if you go in Ethiopia, if you're a woman, you walk into a clinic and you get an abortion, and somebody's able to track you through the system through that is going to be extremely devastating. You'll be ostracized. There's so many things that's going to happen to you. There's excellent research that have been done on not even mentioning Snowden and privacy, but more specifically thinking about minorities, Muslims in the US, and Black Lives Matter movement activists have been surveilled throughout history. Now, when you have this institutionalized at a systemic level, then the ability of these organizations, these big companies knowing where you are, the governments knowing where you are everywhere is quite dangerous. The other part is who are the companies that are providing these systems? It's Palantir, it's the NSO group, it's the big surveillance tech companies that have been used to surveil on activists, to surveil on human rights defenders, and to surveil on journalists. So it's not just about the situation that we're in now in COVID-19, but it's also about how these tools, these systems are going to be used to restrict freedom of expression, to restrict freedom of assembly, and to restrict privacy. Because we only, most people say I have nothing to hide, but you will have something to hide when the stakes are really high, when governments change. We've seen this in the US, we've seen this in Brazil, we see this in many places. There's a direct correlation between the lack of privacy and the insecurity of journalists, activists, human rights defenders. And there's no guarantee that these systems are not going to be used to target us in one way or another.
Thanks very much. Tom Sorell, your research has also looked at protest and protest activity. The requirements for social distancing, how do, in your mind, these requirements take precedence over the right to protest and the right to organize?
Well, this came up concretely in the UK in the last week or so, because we had simultaneous slight easing of the lockdown restrictions and Black Lives Matter protests. Now, that's itself quite remarkable. I think one of the things that's happened during lockdown in the UK, at least, is a much more heightened sense of solidarity. So that, first of all, people have maybe less to pay attention to than they used to in some cases, and they're more open, more receptive to things going on elsewhere. And I think they're particularly receptive to different kinds of solidarity. That's definitely true in the UK around the NHS. So I think that's part of the reason why people were as receptive as they were to the Black Lives Matter movement as well. When it comes to the specific issue of whether it was justified for lots of people to come possibly raise the R number in various parts of the country, or raise the R number possibly in London, if this was potentially something that could have happened, were they justified to do that? Well, I think given the timing of these things, yeah, probably the risk was not that great. But I've asked myself the question: would people have been right to protest in mid lockdown in Minneapolis had the attack on George Floyd happened in mid-lockdown? My answer would be yes. Would they have been justified in protesting in London? I'm not so sure. I think there are some local issues, historical issues, and contextual issues that may affect the justification for breaking lockdown rules. But I do think that that the solidarity phenomenon makes these issues more sensitive or more nuanced than they would have been otherwise.
Thanks very much. So if surveillance has been deemed as an important tool in the toolkit for combating COVID-19, how convinced are we all, how confident are we that we're going to see normalization post-COVID? Berhan, what's your view on this?
Yeah, that's actually one of the most worrying thing, is that we've seen, if you look at the things that happened, because we've started this conversation with, is this a war, right? So it's good to go back and see what are the things that have been normalized since we went into a war. What are the things that have become, our mode of operandus right now, our way of living. And one thing that's extremely worrying is in the manners in which data is being shared from private companies into governments, and the regulators are nowhere to be seen, is one concerning thing. And the worry is that this is going to be normal. The manners in which, again, now even in this context, in the space that I'm in, police brutality has become really rampant. And the fact that we can gamble off people's lives was not what we expected. This was what we had assumed would happen, is going to be the new normal. So these are all of the things that are extremely worrying. The regulators are nowhere to be seen. And then the other things are, it's always important to ask what is happening in a space that we're not seeing it. The other really worrying thing that we're seeing here is public participation. Governments are going ahead, making decisions without any form of public participation. We're not allowed to protest. We're not allowed to go out. We're not allowed to go to parliament and put in our views. So the fact that a lot of vulnerable communities have been disregarded and have been really marginalized from public conversation is going to continue as we, potentially as we move forward from COVID.
Thank you. Florian Kerschbaum, what are your views on normalization? We share a lot of this data all the time, so why is there such a concern now about it?
So there are a number of things to understand. So the first one is important to know why regulation of privacy doesn't work by doing it by individuals. And there is something which is called the privacy paradox. And the privacy paradox says, basically, if I ask you, are you concerned about your private information? Then everybody says, like, I'm very concerned about the privacy. That's a common perception. However, if I offer you the even slightest tiny incentive to give up that personal information, you're absolutely willing to do that. And companies like Facebook and Google are basically banking on this effect by offering you services that are worth a fraction of what the exploitation of the privacy and private information is worth. Now, in the case of the COVID-19 app, and we've touched on this a little bit already, this effect doesn't apply because a COVID-19 app is not in the benefit of the user installing and providing its private information. It's like a face mask. It's in the benefit of the other people that you are protecting by staying at home. So the COVID-19 app is not benefiting from the effect of this privacy paradox. And therefore we see a very different privacy debate than we're seeing for sharing data with private companies. And that is something to keep in mind when we're talking about privacy of these apps in general.
Thanks very much. Tom Sorell, do you think this debate on tracing and tracking apps and technology and the link to privacy is being overemphasized, I should say, especially in Western democracies?
Yes, I do. And I maybe dissent a little bit from what Florian has just said in that when I've been involved in some of the discussions about the app, the UK app, as opposed to other kinds of apps, the same kinds of things that are said in normal times about privacy protections do seem to be asserted. It's as if a kind of formulaic set of considerations about privacy protections are taken to apply all the time and universally, and I don't agree with that. I think that during emergencies, sometimes those norms are overridden. There were many, many things wrong with the UK app. It's just this afternoon been scrapped, or the system that underlies it has been scrapped. But I think it deferred way too much to privacy. It took very schematic information about where people who use the app were, and also quite schematic information about their contacts. And there were lots of default, refusals to share data where possible for people. On the other hand, there was a rhetoric of it's your civic duty to give this information. So there was quite a conflicting set of messages being given. what I find odd is that human track and trace is taken to be so harmless. You know, there are 28,000 people with access to very personal information about people that they've spoken to, people they might form impressions of and gossip about in informal ways. So that privacy problem is never talked about, ever. And the other thing is that in the UK, fraudsters have taken advantage of the existence of human track and trace to telephone people and impersonate track and tracers to say, yeah, we need much more data from you about yourselves. That's not a cybersecurity problem. That's a kind of, you know, pre-cyber type of problem in a way. So on both those grounds, I think the discussion has been skewed.
Thanks very much. Worrying. James Goldgeier, what does all this tell us about the importance of political leadership over national security?
Well, yes. I mean, we've learned how important political leadership is, especially in countries where it's lacking. And I think one of the interesting things that may come out of this pandemic, we'll have to see over the longer run, but, you know, will COVID-19 be the issue that finally sort of breaks the rise of the populist leaders? The populists come to power on grievances. During a pandemic, citizens want a government that can actually get something done. And when we look at the leaders who've done the worst during this pandemic, it's, you know, the US and Trump, Brazil and Bolsonaro, the UK and Johnson, and compare that to Germany, New Zealand, South Korea, Ghana, Greece, places where leaders have performed much better. I think people are noticing that there is a difference between places where you have serious leadership and places where you have people who came to power playing off of resentments and grievances, but who can't actually get anything done.
So Florian Kerschbaum, if this technology is going to live with us and even become more prolific, let's look at the issue of safeguards. How do you build a trustworthy app?
Now, that's a very complicated question, and I led an initiative of 100 Canadian academics where we try to come up with 10 principles of how, from a technology perspective, one can build an app that is trustworthy and privacy enhancing. And these principles, however, admit very many design choices and are not supposed to take a specific direction in the public debate of which app, which level of privacy an app should have, and other things that need to be debated in the general public. However, we try to make some principles of how you could check whether or not things are being done. In particular, I'm concerned about that many apps are being developed without people who have the proper expertise in privacy and security technology. And that can lead to apps that are making false claims that mislead and that are basically undermining the trust in the public debate. So we try to come up with how to be able to design apps that are worthy of the trust that people should put into them.
Berhan, Taye, what do you feel about data protection and digital rights beyond the pandemic? You lead campaigns that are trying to prevent internet shutdowns, continue with access. Of course, that means that a stream of data has to be with us at all times. So what are your views post-pandemic?
Yeah, I think, you know, this conversation is a bit skewed because some countries have really amazing data protection legislations. You know, the institutions are really good and they're keeping a check, and you know there's a checks and balance. And other countries there's completely nothing, right? Like we see governments arm twisting ISPs and internet service providers and others to provide, you know, unfettered access to data. This is also happening at the same time where surveillance has been normalized and happens in every context that we're in. So for us, this is, to be honest, especially for the digital rights community, this is an alarming moment that we're all in, where our worst nightmares, things that we would wildly not think about, have become so normalized that, you know, NSO group is collaborating with governments to provide tools for ordinary citizens to use. So I think one important thing is really the checks and balance. there has to be oversight mechanisms. There has to be, the regulators have to be at the forefront of this conversation. The public oversight has to be there. Without it, we're really going to lose this battle. The second one is, governments are doing all of these things, but then censorship and all of the really terrible things that used to happen online are still happening at an exponential rate. If you look at cybersecurity, if you look at a lot of the things, like whether it's and if the previous speaker has alluded to, the scams that are happening online and offline, and all of the things that are happening in this space are all confluent. It's not all of this is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in addition to many other things that we're experiencing. So regulators have to be at the front of this. They have to be the ones leading this. Oversight mechanisms have to be established, and tech is not the only solution. So our focus can't be just on collecting all of this data. It also has to be our social fabrics. What are we providing to the people that are affected? What are we providing to make sure that we build a community? We're not at war. We should not have a war response. We should have a collective response to this. So this, for us, I think that's what's really critical. And building our community and building our campaigns to make sure that digital rights of users, people that will be most affected by these policies and these legislations and these efforts are protected from the worst.
Thank you. Let's continue with that theme, because we're living in a world at the moment with a lot of misinformation and disinformation, particularly with regards to COVID. So Tom, Sorell, is there anything we can do at the national level and the global level about misinformation?
Yes, I think so. I think that one of the things that I think would help is if there were more sort of self-conscious fact-checking resources, more prominent in social media. Another thing that would help is if the presentation of COVID updates was done by public health people without politicians present. This ritual we have every day in the UK, where Boris Johnson or some other politician comes along and the public health people are there, they sometimes say themselves as human shields. That's unacceptable. So one of the issues that, one of the things that I'm interested in is how can there be a channel of communication, independent channel of communication to the wider world of public health people, uncontaminated by political spin. That's one thing that I'm interested in. But I think, COVID is just another reminder of the importance of science education for the whole world. There's so much misinformation, some of it emanating from the White House about, what is a COVID cure or what isn't a COVID cure. Many people, especially in the States, thought it was a hoax. All of this kind of blether is really the result of huge ignorance of science. And I'm really keen that science both be domesticated in the sense of being made every day, and also be given its own channels of communication somehow. Those are policy priorities I would have.
Well, on the subject of science, let's turn to a scientist for his views on misinformation. Florian, give us a technology perspective on the issue of misinformation and disinformation.
So the issue of misinformation from a technology perspective is very difficult to handle, in the sense that it is not easy to determine automatically, for example, using artificial intelligence or machine learning, what is misinformation. Most attempts at that have failed. And it starts already with the problem of establishing a ground truth. So if you go to the US, then half of the population believes that drinking bleach will cure COVID-19, and the other half doesn't. So what is the ground truth? And this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but it is not easy to do that, solving this problem using technology. And one point I can make is the best thing a government can do, for example, to help with the use of COVID-19 apps, is to create transparency. to be transparent about what they do, to involve the public, to have a continuous debate, to be present in the press about privacy issues, about what they do, about what they collect of types of information. If there is transparency, then there is less opportunity for misguided information. So I have to say, I've been following the COVID-19 tracing app in a rollout in Germany. And I have to say it was done exemplary, in my opinion, because they have used trustworthy actors. The trustworthy actors have involved the public in the design process, in the discussion of what an app should be done. The design principle have been set properly, and it was actually, in my opinion, done really, really, really well, even viewing it from a perspective of Canada. And I would hope that other countries could follow that kind of transparency that was done in this process. And however, the sad thing to see is that current surveys say that only 42% of Germans are willing to install the app. So even with that level of transparency and that really exemplary process, they were not getting up the numbers of acceptance to a level where they should be. So difficult issue.
Really difficult issue. Berhan, you look at this from a regional, international, global perspective, campaign perspective, and advocacy perspective. Many questions are coming in from the audience about how we pursue this regionally and internationally with such low levels of international cooperation evident at the moment.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Like, so when we're talking about even now misinformation and disinformation, and where I'm sitting, a bunch of journalists have been arrested for sharing actually what might be actually factual information, right? Like, and if you go, like, if you drive 4 hours out of Nairobi and go to Tanzania, the government has banned journalists, doctors from sharing any information about COVID. If you go down to Ethiopia, a journalist has been arrested. In South Africa, they've made sharing misinformation illegal. So this even context of what is misinformation, what's not, how do we deal with this, is so complex in so many ways. The other one point that I would also a bit question here is this idea of fact checking. How many fact checkers can you have for every misinformation that's spread, right? So the platforms have to take some responsibility as well. There has to be some form of conversation about content governance and how do we, how do we go from here? So that's one. The second one is, so the lack of international cooperation, I think for me, is really, again, alludes to this idea of we're at war. We don't collaborate, we collect everything that we can, and we close our borders, and we fight this invisible enemy. That's not the case. In many communities, where, again, what the news, the media is not showing us is that, a lot of the poor and low-income communities are collaborating. That's the only way they're able to survive and feed themselves. So I think what we need is this really bottoms-up approach, in a sense that, it has to be from the bottom level, from the people that are at the forefront of this, facing this without any subsistence from government support, without any, collaboration with people that have been fired from their jobs, people that are, at the forefront of, being able to provide the support that we need. These are the people that we should really tap to and figure out, what has Germany done so well? Why were they really successful? What has Sweden done well? How were they successful? I think that should be the way to go about it. That the lack of international cooperation, this assumption that we're at war and we're all on our own, is not the way to go. And we failed one too many times.
Thank you. Tom Sorell, there are questions coming in, particularly from African scholars and our African colleagues on various parts of the continent, about separate legal data protection law for COVID-19. For research purposes, the use of data for research purposes, because abuse of the data is expected. Do we need separate legal data protection law for this?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think this depends on the jurisdiction. I myself feel that Western European data protection law is overdone. I have many sort of minor disagreements with many implications of data protection law. I mean, especially data protection law when it comes to AI-assisted technology and quite a few other things. But I'm not sure whether this legal regime, even if you introduced a lot of laws, is super easy to enforce. I think it's very difficult to enforce a lot of this law. And I do think that, there's a lot of controversy over, what's an important privacy violation and what isn't. I mean, even on this panel, I was glad that James said, yeah, we do have to sacrifice a bit of privacy in this case for the sake of the virus. I agree completely, we do. And we also have to sacrifice it because of the time it takes to defer to it and the necessity of a test, track, and trace system that accommodates, that works quickly enough to save lives. So I don't think the way to go is to introduce yet more data protection legislation. I think the way to go is to have, much more frank discussions between researchers who are impeded sometimes by data protection unjustifiably. I'm talking about public sector researchers, for those discussions to take place with regulators, rather than, having a large, let's go back to the basics type of law reform. That's my quick answer. Don't expect data protection law to be a help.
Florian Kerschbaum, what about anonymization? Can we do more with anonymization techniques?
So a lot of the principles of data protection law are based on the fact that anonymized data is no longer personal identifiable data and can be used. And for example, for research purposes or for other purposes. Now, if we look at something like the GDPR, then we see that there is even another category, which is called pseudonymization. And next to the law aspects that try to govern this from a legal perspective, I can speak to the technical perspective. And all I can say is that there is definitely next to the law a need to interpret this law in a technical manner. And that is where it fails, in my opinion, in a lot of cases. So actually the law might be interpreted as being overly protective or underly protective from both sides because the interpretation of the law is so unclear. So anonymization, for example, is terribly difficult. It is so difficult that even most of the absolute superstars in the academic research community could not properly tell you what it means to be anonymized. And a lot of data might not even be anonymizable in the first place without completely scrapping it. So it is not clear to what extent we can use the categories that are currently embedded in data privacy regulation in a technical way, and how do we interpret them properly. So there's a lot of need to maybe not reform data privacy regulation, but to make it more technically informed and distinguish cases which are currently either put into the same category or similar cases which are put into different categories. And that is, of course, a major effort. Not that I would be able to tell you how to do that, but I think that would be definitely something that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. James Goldgeier, there are a number of questions coming in about comments that you made earlier concerning the fact that people are not following rules. When public confidence in the government drops, lots drops with it. So how do you get a skeptical populace who is already tired of following rules to buy into these things, contact tracing apps, and ignore certain privacy concerns?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, on the one hand, we're all tired of following this, right? I mean, who doesn't want to get out and just go back to normal? I come back to Tom's earlier point, though, about sort of the anti-science views that the White House promulgates. The virus doesn't really care whether we believe in science or not. I mean, it's going forward. And I would say that while we do see people, certainly in the United States, who've decided that they don't want to follow proper behavior for addressing the pandemic, We'll see what happens if this rally really goes forward in Tulsa on Saturday. 20,000 people in an indoor arena with Trump. It's just, you know, pretty crazy. But on the other hand, it is heartening in the United States anyway to see over the last month or two public opinion numbers on particular issues that we just haven't seen in a long time in the United States, where you have a vast majority of the population supporting things that, you know, they should support. The vast majority supports keeping the social distancing rules in place. The vast majority of people do get that they need to wear masks. You know, Florian mentioned that he was exaggerating when he said half think you can drink bleach. I mean, thankfully, in fact, the vast majority don't think that drinking bleach is a good idea. And we see this also with Black Lives Matter. You know, the vast majority think that something needs to be done about this police brutality. The vast majority believe that we should be tearing down Confederate monuments. So I actually think there's a good news population story in the United States that we have not seen in a long time, where we've just taken it as a given that, you know, if half the population believes in X, then the other half of the population believes in the opposite of X. And so I'm hopeful, more hopeful about the population, but the lack of leadership at the top is still a serious hindrance.
And not only a lack of leadership at the national level, but at the international level as well. UN's been criticized over the last few months for being so silent on these issues. So Florian Kerschbaum, do you have any ideas about how we can govern this at the international level moving forward? Do we need an international organization for internet governance, privacy governance? Tell us your views.
I think we definitely do. There has been the French agenda on cybersecurity, which has been driven by Macron. And this mostly governed aspects like cybersecurity and cyber war, where we have nation state actors attacking public companies in other countries, which is something that we have not seen before. And however, it also applies to privacy. And as a scholar, I believe that security cannot exist without privacy. And we sort of need to come to an understanding. So it is easy for a company like Google to put a data center somewhere in Mountain View and collect data about Canadians, about people in Ethiopia, about people in the UK. So clearly the internet provides boundaries, and it's very difficult for local governance to set clear standards of what they expect. And there is definitely the need for international coordination.
Thank you very much. Is this a view from Africa, Berhan?
I don't think I represent the African view because we're so many here, but I think, so the thing is, you know, we have the Internet Governance Forum and we have many other platforms that, you know, try to govern internet conversations. And whether we're talking about the Paris call, the Christ call, one thing that has been common amongst all of these spaces is that it's, you know, it's heavily US and America dominated. So we can't, like, you know, even sitting now today here, we can't think of an international cooperation that only includes, you know, you guys and, you know, excludes the majority of the world. So when we're thinking of bringing up this sort of issues at an international level, you know, surveillance can't be, when we used to talk about surveillance, it was just about Snowden. It's not about the Black Lives Matter folks that have been surveilled all their lives, right? It's not about the individuals that have been called terrorists. It's not about the minorities, right? So if the conversation is going to be nuanced at that level, yes, international cooperation is very good. But if, you know, if all, I'm sorry for saying this, but if the majority, you know, global North folks are going to gather and talk about the rest of the world, then we already have that. So I don't see why we would need another platform that would do that. And then privacy is also really contextualized, right? Like, so how do you bring that context into that space? So these are all the questions I think we should have before saying, you know, we need an international platform, another one that could gather people.
Thank you. Florian, back to you for a moment, because there's been a few questions coming in that look at attacks on hospitals during the pandemic and ask the question, why do you feel that there haven't been wide-scale ransomware attacks on hospitals during this pandemic? wouldn't it be even higher leverage than usual for would-be perpetrators?
So there might be an opportunity for perpetrators to believe that hospitals would need to use buy themselves out of ransomware attacks. However, I don't believe that a hospital would be shut down by a ransomware attack, because if we are in emergency mode, we treat people even if we do not charge them, right? You would not let a COVID-19 patient die only because you cannot send him a bill afterwards. The attacks on hospitals have been, in my opinion, mostly on collecting data about what is actually going on in these countries, how much cases do we have, what can we say, rather than trying to extort money from hospitals and providing this kind of misinformation.
Thank you. James Goldgeier, what does all this mean, in your view, for international affairs? Next week's session is going to focus on the future of the international order moving forward, but we're all representing institutes of international affairs. These are big issues and relatively new issues. What does it mean for the study of international affairs moving forward?
Well, I'll look forward to tuning in next week. It sounds like that'll be a great conversation. And I think, it's important to remember that we haven't even gotten to the key cooperative moment during this pandemic. And that's what happens when there's a vaccine that needs to be produced and delivered and given to billions of people. How is that going to happen? Do we have international structures that would foster the kind of cooperation that's going to be required to get that vaccine out there? And I think it's also what we've seen in this pandemic. It's a reminder that when the United States is absent, there is no other country that can play a global leadership role. And as long as the United States is following an America First approach, global cooperation is going to be just much more difficult than it would otherwise be. We see scientists collaborating across borders, which is great. It's important. The U.S. government should be fostering that cooperation and not be indifferent or even hostile to it. But I also want to pick up on a point that Berhan was making, sort of about, which I think is important in thinking about the United States going forward. It's possible that we will see a different kind of U.S. effort after January 20th of next year. But the United States cannot play the kind of role that it did in the international system previously. And I think those in the United States who might wish to see a U.S. that is more cooperative and is more engaged as a global leader will need to recognize that an important feature of U.S. global leadership in 2021 and beyond, if that's what we have, is that the United States needs to be a lot better about listening and learning from others. I mean, the points Berhan was making, the United States should be thinking, well, who's doing what in other parts of the world that we could actually learn from and help amplify, as opposed to thinking that all the answers to international problems come from Washington, D.C. And I think that'll be a critical component to international order in 2021 and beyond.
Thank you. I want to ask all the panelists as one last question, and bearing in mind we've got lots of policymakers that are tuning in with the audience today. Tom Sorell, let's start with you. If you had a suite of policymakers in front of you, what would be your advice or issues that they should consider at this moment?
Well, I have a couple. One of them, is connected with, this science messaging business. It seems to me that one of the things that's, that we really need is much more public understanding of science and much more respect for science and much more talking up of the benefits of science. That's one thing. The other thing is we have in the UK something called National Risk Register. I wish people had read it some time ago because it's had pandemic as the most likely, most serious risk for a long, long time, probably for the last 10 or 11 years. That document is rarely, I think, looked at by the general public. It is also connected to some legislation called the Civil Contingencies Act, which is, you know, high-grade emergency legislation that's extremely disruptive. So I think that, you know, those kinds of national publicity for risks, those things are much more important. But beyond that, it's something I've already raised, which is that we should decouple science and public health from politicians. There really needs to be a channel where these folks can talk to the public without, you know, the contamination of, you know, Donald Trump.
Thank you. Go ahead. Sorry. Any last minute comments? 5 seconds.
Okay, so for me, transparency is key. So if you want to collect data, if you want to install measures, be transparent about what you do and why you do it. And have these kind of public debates that we're having right now. Be open. That will make the hugest difference. Be transparent. That will make the hugest difference that I can imagine.
I agree. Transparency always key. Berhan, what would you say to a suite of policymakers in front of you?
I would say don't make policies for your friends. Think of people that are at the margins, right? Like, so the sex workers are suffering in many parts of the world because they can't fend for themselves. Women that are looking for abortion right now are being forced into spaces that are not really pleasant, you know, poor people, low income people, and homeless people. These are all people that we're not considering, that are completely outside of our margins, and government seems to be making policies for their friends, for rich people, and for middle income folks. And that is unacceptable and can't be the way that we can go, you know, forward.
Thank you. And James, finish us off. What would you say to a group of heads of state at the moment?
Well, my main message actually is for U.S. policymakers, but I suppose you could make it broader. One, show greater humility. And two, recommit to multilateral institutions like the World Health Organization. I'm actually quite confident that if there's a change in leadership in the United States, we'll see the recommitment to multilateral institutions and hopefully a reinvigoration by the United States with other partners to reinvigorate the World Health Organization. The jury's still out on the humility. It's not something that the United States has shown a lot of in the past, and I hope that if there is a change in administration going forward, that we'll actually see some of that as well.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists today for that extremely interesting, timely, and compelling discussion. I'm sure that the audience will agree that it was really worth listening to, and I, as moderator, learned a lot. For everybody out there in the audience, please join us next week for the final session in this Global Insights panel series, featuring, quite appropriately, the title, COVID-19 and the Future of the International Order. Until then, stay safe, take care, and stay united. Goodbye.